Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This is Jill Hurston. I'm the Marketing Director at Synerzip. We have a lot of information to share with you today. I want to just first of all tell you all that I am recording this session and you will get a direct link to the recording tomorrow from me and a link to the slides. So no worries about that. And during the presentation at any time, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We most likely will not get to any questions, but we will answer them offline. We have so much information today to share. Our presentation today is going to be from Vinayak Joglekar. He is our co-founder and CTO. He's based in India, Pune, India, where our development center is. We have Florence Lowe. She is our COO, who is based in Dallas at our United States headquarters. And then we have Mike Watson, who is our VP of Engineering, who is located in our Austin, Texas office. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we attended the Agile 2019 conference that's put on by Agile Alliance. It was August 5th through the 9th in Washington, D.C., and there were over 2,500 registrants and from over 50 countries. It was a buzz with people. There were so many sessions. There were 22 tracks with over 300 sessions. So we had a really hard time deciding which takeaways to share with you today. The inspirational keynotes were great, and I'm sure they've all made it to our top 10, and we'll share those with you. So on the next slide, we have the 22 tracks that were at the conference. We're not going to go through these, but you'll have it in the recording. And then on the next slide, these are our takeaways. Feel free to tweet to Vinayak, Florence, or Mike at any time. Their Twitter handles are right there at the top. And these are actually, we had top 12 this time, which we always do because 10 is just, we can't get it all in. So before I hand it over to Florence, I just want to remind you to go ahead and ask questions. We most likely will not get through all 12 top 10, but we will finish recording it offline and send the rest out to you so you have all of the information. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Florence.
Thanks, Jill. This is Florence Lowe here in Dallas, and let me get started right away. We have a lot of material. So my first takeaway from Agile 2019 was setting up for success is half the battle. I'll share the highlights of two talks that I really enjoyed. The first was by Kathy Aragon and Alfred Lorber of the Sandia National Labs, and the second one was by Alex Kanan, an Agile coach at USAA. So setting up for success with team rooms and team agreements. Why is this important? People and collaboration. At the core of it, people and how we work together is what makes anything worth doing. And we know instinctively and through research that where we work, what it looks like, what it feels like, has an impact on our levels of stress and satisfaction. So how do we start? We create Agile workspaces. This is a design term for a place where people can collaborate, focus, learn, socialize, and get some alone time. So what does that mean for Agile teams? We need a stand-up room with a dedicated space or a dedicated wall. We need meeting rooms that can be scheduled at short notice. We need a shared workroom, shared across teams, and we need a dedicated workroom for a team, for one team. Now, smaller companies, and some of our clients tend to be smaller companies, may choose to just have one room. So how do you go about creating the space? What did they do? In a very agile fashion, they involved the entire team. They found an inspiration, in their case, Star Trek: The Next Generation. They got requirements, prioritized, voted, and communicated throughout the process. So what did they end up with? This is the space they ended up with. There's a lot of spaces for collaboration in this space, and it really met their needs. This space feels a little dark to me, but the important point is the team came together on this space, and it works for them, and it has all the elements of an agile workspace. So meanwhile, realistically, we know that most technology teams today are very distributed. So what do we do about that? Alex gave a wonderful talk on team agreements, and this was more of an experience report. This was the situation he walked into. A US-based team in Texas, an India-based team in Mumbai. Alex is a new coach who has just joined the team, and he notices there are some challenges. They have 2-minute retros. Everything is good. There are no impediments. He notices the time zone issues, cultural barriers, lack of engagement, lack of shared ownership. So he jumps right in and tries to solve the issue. What does he do? Provides feedback. That doesn't go as well as he thought it would. So he takes a step back and tries to start again. What does he do this time? Build trust. Give everyone a voice. Don't just have the team leader speak for the team. We can learn from Alex's experience of using Scrum values to align the team, giving the team the ability to have safety to speak their mind, an environment where everyone speaks, simple things like enunciating properly, muting yourself when you're not speaking. We learned a lot of lessons along the way that he shared with us, leveraging Scrum values as we just talked about, building respect and trust, be patient, be human first, and evolve these working agreements. If you notice, we didn't get into the details of what a team agreement is. It really is not about the team agreement. It's about how you get to the team agreements, with the focus on individuals and the interaction. To build an awesome team like this. This was a great slide. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Mike to speak on empathy and leadership.
Thank you, Florence, and hi everyone. This is Mike Watson, VP of Engineering based in Austin, Texas, as Jill had mentioned. So my first takeaway was related to empathy and leadership, and the speaker was Paul Tevis. It was very engaging, and he started with this story, which I'm going to try to boil down to extremely quickly in this version. Essentially, in southeast Alaska, the otters were hunted to extinction, and what happened is because the otters were gone and they were no longer feeding on the sea urchins, and the sea urchins basically deforested all the kelp out of the area, and it really hurt the ecosystem. So in 1960, they moved a bunch of otters back into the ecosystem, and since then the ecosystem has thrived. It's the otters took care of the sea urchins, and then the kelp came back, and then now there's a lush underwater forest, lots of fish, and the side effect of that happening is not only were there more fish, but also the eagle population grew about 25%. Next slide, please. So what this is called in nature is a keystone species. So this is a species that their presence actually amplifies the ecosystem. And when it ceases to exist, it could eliminate the ecosystem. Another example of this you may have heard of is wolves in Yellowstone. Introduction of wolves into Yellowstone was controversial, but it actually, because of the nature of that ecosystem, has actually prevented erosion. And I'll let you work out why that happened. But so this keystone species concept definitely is out there. Next slide, please. So in The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg talks about keystone habits, which essentially similar, where certain habits create chain reactions that make other good habits easier to maintain. And the classic example is around exercise. When you exercise, you start feeling better, you want to eat better, and then other side effects also happen. Next slide. So what Paul did is he took these two concepts together and said, what if empathy in a leader has the same effect in a human ecosystem? And so he came with this idea that the leader's habits of empathy form a keystone for their overall effectiveness. And this is the key takeaway I took from this particular talk, and one of the most important takeaways I had personally from Agile 2019. Next slide. So he goes on to talk about what empathy is, and The War of Kindness is a book that he referenced. And it breaks up empathy into sharing, thinking about, and caring, which are three different elements. And in particular, leaders can really do the thinking about part. So try to understand how other people are feeling and try to leverage that in a powerful way. Next slide, please. So the advantages of empathy in leadership is you're going to get more productive teams. You're going to be able to deal with diversity better. And one other side point is if you're able to lead with both backbone and heart, not as competing factors, but together. So what that means is still having conviction, but also taking in the feeling of the team and leveraging the power of everyone's opinions. Then you're going to have the most powerful outcome. Next slide, please. So finally, he left us with 7 empathy habits. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but one thing I will point out is the first 3 you can do without actually talking to anybody. This is just you observing your environment in a better way, and you can start having more empathy. And with that, I'll pass it over to Vinayak.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Vinayak Joglekar, calling in from Pune, India. I'm one of the co-founders and CTO of Synerzip. So the takeaways that I'm going to share, to start with, the big takeaway this time was the way user experience became a part of the sprint. So I'll talk a little bit more about it. So this session was by Gary Pedretti, and then there was another session by Luis Pazinello on business owners. So we'll cover these 2 in these takeaways. Next slide, please. So, so far we have been hearing user experience design having a separate sprint by itself. So, there were many discussions before this in our top 10 takeaways in the previous years, where we always talked about a design sprint, which preceded the development sprints. And that's where the user experience design kind of got handed down, which is slightly waterfallish. So I always kind of felt that we require design to be a part of the sprint, because design is not a one-time process, but it's an ongoing process, because we learn from the feedback that we get from the end users at the end of every sprint. And based on that, we have to make the design has to evolve, and it can't be something that is frozen or cast in stone at the beginning of the development sprint. So it was kind of waterfallish and counterintuitive, and we kind of immediately agreed when Gary Pedretti proposed that instead of having a design sprint, let's have an ongoing process where we make design and UX designer as a part of the cross-functional team. And it sounded like a very good idea, but next slide, please. When you look at the personalities or personas of UX designers and compare those with the developers, this is what happens. So on this slide, there is this, what the inner voice of a developer says about UX designer on the left-hand side. For example, they feel that they take too long. And on the right-hand side, the UX designers say that, you can't demand final signed-off design in a time box, because after all, we are creative people and you can't time box creativity. So there is a lot of this ground that needs to be covered before these 2 ends can meet. Now, the example here some of you might have had the experience of working in those times when for the first time developers and QA engineers started working together. Previously, in the days of waterfall, they used to be in separate silos. And there again, there was this disconnect because developers were wired to build things and testers were wired to break things. So, but finally, now we see cross-functional teams working very well, like well-oiled machines with developers and testers. It's just that we gave them the time they needed to work together. So same way, the solution here is to let the UX designers be a part of the Scrum team for some days. There would be some kind of input impedance, if you will, but eventually things will sort themselves out. So time is the only solution for this. Next slide, please. So here's the summary of the solution, and there are some recommendations what you would do. Main takeaway here is to, instead of having us and them, we should always use we as a team and, treat all work as first class, whether it is UX or whether it is development. With that, next slide, please. So I'm dovetailing into the next topic on the way the user experience or the end user's requirements are being responded to today. We think of these as product requirements, but in fact, product requirements are a result of business requirements. So when you see that requirements are changing, if you go into a little detail, you find that it's the business environment that is changing, and as a business, we need to respond to that. And when we change or when we respond to that by changing the business strategy, that is what results in the change of requirements. So if you think of agile development that we have talked about so far over the last decade or so, is about responding to change in requirements. But now a broader and more evolved thinking is coming into the play, where we talk about business agility, where how business as a whole is responding to the change in the environment. So business agility is something that where you have to adapt quickly to market changes, respond rapidly to customer demands, etc. So this is essentially about working in an uncertain business environment, and there is a new role called business owner. So just the way we have a product owner, we have this new role of business owner. So in this slide, you see what he does and what he doesn't do. So it is more of a role and not a position. It's not, you please don't mistake business owner with a founder or somebody who owns the equity in business, but it's a role just like product owner, where he is a business coach and a visionary, and he is not doing product strategy, or he's not doing any business analysis or product management work, but he is more of a program leader level person, and he does more of business strategy and less of product strategy. He doesn't do product strategy. So the next slide, please. Here it will become clear that there is what you see in the yellow colored box is more of a business perspective, and what you see in the green colored boxes is more of product perspective. So the business owner is one level above the product owner, and eventually, as the business accelerator model shows, the organization goes from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. You will have multiple product owners reporting to a business owner, and maybe a product manager having multiple product owners reporting to him, and a business owner on top. So this is generally the structure which will evolve, where you have a business owner who kind of is like at a program level, who's managing how these multiple products work in consonance to respond to change in the business environment to execute a business strategy. Next slide, please. Yeah, with that, I'll let Florence take over.
Thanks, Vinayak. I think you make a very important point. In fact, I find myself, when I talk to startups now, talking a lot about building a business instead of building a product. I think very often we focus a lot on the product and not just on how the rest of it is going to work. So with that, I'm going to go to my to our fourth takeaway. And as you can see, I call on Sun Tzu again, but starting right. This was based on a talk by Angie Doyle and Tanya Lancaster, who are based out of South Africa. And they gave a talk on 3-to-1 sprint off. I love the abstract. It's really, it really spoke to me. Getting new teams to work together is hard. Do we forget that it's people that are actually doing the work? So their hypothesis is they believe the key to high-performance teams is creating an intentional culture that respects and embraces diversity. And they gave some really practical tools. All of us have seen some variation of it in our careers, but I just wanted to highlight them a little bit in this talk. The tool that they highlighted was the Team Canvas, which has about 9 aspects to it, and they have a working session for each of these 9 aspects of bringing a team together. I'm just going to go through a couple of them, and there are some resources that are on these slides and other resources that are out there that you can look up. But what I really found interesting about this, so if you go to the first one that I'm highlighting, working on purpose. So founders and the executives of a company probably know or feel like they know what the purpose is of either the product or the business. But what I really liked about this is they're advocating that this is an exercise that a new team that is coming together does in a very hands-on fashion, and have everyone in the team, in the entire team, write out the problem statement, write the skills that the team brings to the problem, and what the solution they're creating would make the world a better place. And I think that was really deep, because we work with a lot of the leaders of organizations, and I think there can sometimes be a dissonance between the leaders of an organization and everyone on the team. And the better informed the team is, and the better agreed the team is on what the purpose is, the better the outcome will be. Another one that I wanted to highlight was common goals. They have this wonderful board game that they've created with different questions that get asked throughout the game. And everyone that is playing the game has to answer those questions. And they might be about SMART goals, specific, measurable, and these questions can help tease out any differences in thinking that people might have, and come up with the best solution for whatever problem they're tackling. The other aspect of the Team Canvas is setting your personal goals and kind of talking about those goals with the rest of the team, so we're all aligned. And they advocate not just SMART, but smarter goals. The E and R stand for evaluating and rethinking. These are frameworks that a lot of us know and a lot of us have used. The aspect that I liked that they highlighted was doing this with the team and sharing it with the team, so that we can all be on the same page and really get to know each other. Another aspect is the communication. How do we communicate and keep everyone up to date? There are wonderful resources out there. One of them is the Scrum Kickoff Planner, and there's a link to this in here, which really lays out all the things that we need to be thinking about. And I know we all try to do this, and we say we do this and we have this, but I really like the idea of making it very, very explicit, putting it together with the team, and really communicating that across the board from the beginning, and then iterating that throughout the course of the project. So we're not going to go over every aspect of the team canvas, but what I found was key was work it through with the team and make it fun. So all these games and tools that they have made it really fun and interesting, and get real alignment. And that real alignment comes through lots of conversations when your guard comes down. And your guard comes down when trust is formed. And trust is formed when people get to know each other and what drives them. And back to their abstract, getting teams to work together is hard. How do we do this? We have to do this very intentionally, and I love the tools that they shared. What does this have to do with Agile? People and collaboration. You'll find this is a big theme of mine. But without the people and without the collaboration, we don't have a product, we don't have a business. With that, I'm going to pass it to Mike to talk about metrics.
Thanks, Florence. Yeah, so my interests fall into leadership topics and also how to plan releases better. So the second takeaway is in that second group. John Tanner did this great, it was one of the last sessions of the Agile 2019. He did this great talk on how metrics could be used for good or evil. He started off by saying, what are metrics exactly? And he put up all this information about textbook versions of what metrics are. And he said, well, maybe it's just as simple as this. We want to build some good stuff, and we want to know it's good. Maybe that's what metrics really help us do. Next slide, please. So we talked about the evils of metrics, and I thought there's a couple of really good takeaways here, but the main takeaway is the evil is when these metrics become perverse incentives, and they're used as a way to punish the team as opposed to promote growth in the process. Talk about metrics and people gaming the system, trying to work around metrics. And Doc Norton, who had another talk, his Twitter handle is Doc on Dev, if you're interested. He said maybe it's the managers setting the targets that are actually gaming the system, and not the employees. They're just working with the system they're given. Next slide. So Doc Norton, one of his key things he likes to talk about is he has this topic called escape velocity. And basically the point is don't use velocity as a metric. It's a great planning tool, not so great for metrics because of the reasons mentioned here. It's lagging indicator, it's easy to game. Just don't do it. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some metrics that are on the good and evil side. And actually, since everything is debatable, I decided to say evil and less evil, because I'm sure someone can find evil in any metric. Next slide, please. So what are healthier metric practices? So John ultimately ended up talking about how the ultimate goal is to be able to tie metrics back to the company mission so that everyone knows why they're doing what they're doing. And I think that's really powerful. So a company having an important mission statement that actually describes how they're influencing the world and making it better. And then everyone can have metrics that help tie into that. That's much better. Also, building trust is very important. You'll hear that across multiple sessions, especially in leadership. And being transparent is also very important. Why are you doing the metrics? Why does this matter? And then finally, this last point I want you to take away from this is measure the work, not the people. And what that means is focus on metrics that increase the flow, that solve problems in the process, and don't use them to as punitive measures against the people. And with that, I'll pass it to Vinayak.
Thanks, Mike. So I have been covering DevOps for that is one of the areas I am passionate about. So today I'm going to cover a session by Rich Mills where he talked about building pipelines, and another by Anil Jaisingh and Suresh Chinnam where they talk about telemetry. So next slide, please. So so far, doing continuous integration and continuous delivery with large monoliths was only a theoretical possibility. It was really very hard because one can imagine if your regression tests, which are mostly automated, some of them are manual, and it takes several hours to run the entire regression suite for a monolith. So building something which will do continuous delivery is not really meaningful, because your continuous means maybe if you really try hard, maybe once a day or even less frequent. With the advent of microservices, it has become possible to really do continuous integration and continuous delivery in a practical manner. So Rich talked about how to build a pipeline which is doing continuous integration and continuous delivery for microservices. So you will see from left to right, there are multiple stages. Obviously, we are using Dockerized small microservices. So at the first stage, you have, you compile and do some kind of testing using code scanning or static analysis. So those tools like SonarQube, etc. are listed there. In the second stage, you actually deploy. So there you have tools like Docker, Ansible, and OpenShift, and then you use a pipelining tools like Liquibase and test using testing tools like which are for performance testing like JMeter or other exploratory testing, which could be manual. At the end of it, you promote. So promotion means if it passes all the tests, it goes from prod to test and from test to dev. And finally, you have, once it goes into dev, you monitor and you operate by doing continuous monitoring using tools like Splunk, Prometheus, or Nessus. So useful slide, I found a lot of good tools that we use for microservices listed here on this slide. Next slide, please. So the main takeaway here is to treat pipeline code just like your application code, which follows the same branching strategy like hotfixes or release branches or feature branches. So check in your pipeline code along with your, let it be the first class citizen, and just follow the same branching and merging strategy you have for your application code. Talking about pre-merging with master and deploying on demand in ephemeral environment, I'll show that in the next slide, and how you do that. Each service has its own pipeline, so let's not have a single pipeline and then try to push every service through it. Each microservice will have its own pipeline, and it will have its own home in the code base. And finally, let's have more of end-to-end full stack developers developing this, because finally the team that is developing now needs to be more of a vertical team where they have the same team has control of the UI plus API. This again you will see in the next slide. So please, next slide. So here you will see the UI and the API. The UI at the top and API at the bottom. It goes through the microservices, go through build unit testing and static analysis, and then after the PR, you deploy them in an ephemeral environment where most of it is all memory based. It's not actually, most of it may be mocked also. So you have APIs being mocked or the UI being mocked here, depending on what you're testing. And then you smoke test it and then deploy it in development staging. So this is where you merge your two sides, the UI side and the API side. And after deploying, you promote it. Then you again do the user acceptance testing, and finally you deploy it in production. At each stage, there are different levels of testing. It's like regression testing, security, integration, all sorts of testing that happens. And then finally, once you deploy it in production, if it passes all these tests, you deploy it in production and do smoke testing. So this gives a schematic what are the different test stages in the pipeline. But the main takeaway is that your pipeline code is a part of, it's the first class citizen of your code base, and it follows the same strategy for branching and merging as your application code. That was the main takeaway. So with this, let me talk a little bit about, next slide please. The telemetry that goes to bring observability and traceability to distributed applications. It's not as easy as it used to be in monoliths. So in case of, so this is one of the experiments they talked about, where in this experiment what they realized was giving the users the decision to control themselves is a better way to control the speed. So in this you have a speed gun which is being used by a cop who's implementing speed control by command and control. Instead of that, let's just have that speed gun display the speed and let the user self-manage. So what they observed in this garden grow experiment was what you see on the right hand side, where you give control to the end users, works better. So following the same principle, let's have the users trace, log and observe what is happening in production. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. So this is how the modern telemetry ecosystem looks like. So you have sidecars such as Envoy or Fluentd, which are like sensors which are next to, so in case of Kubernetes, you have pods in which your microservices are running, and each pod has its own sidecar which extracts the useful data, and then it could be passed on to a matrix router. This router in turn passes it on to an aggregator. So these typically this data is a lot of data, logs, events, metrics, traces, and then it is processed through, first of all it is stored, we'll talk a little bit about that, and then you have some kind of notification based on what alerts need to go out, what scheduling needs to happen using tools like Prometheus, Elastic, InfluxDB, and also dashboards, visualization using tools like Grafana and Kibana. So this was a good slide which shows the different ways in which your telemetry can be instrumented. Next slide, please. This was a new tool and a new learning for me. This tool is called NiFi, so which kind of acts as a central point for integrating acquisition, processing and storage of data, because you are talking about a lot of data, as I said earlier. So this data is again, prolific and coming from different sources. It could be Jenkins, it could be Jira, Bitbucket, GitHub, SAP, Travis, and finally it also needs to be analyzed using various tools like you have Spark or Mesos or Kubernetes, and it has to be stored in somewhere like MongoDB or Oracle. So there has to be something that holds all this together. So the tool that I learned here was called NiFi by Apache. So useful tool. So this was one of the main takeaways. With that, yeah, please next. I think it's Florence, your turn.
That's right. Thanks, Vinayak. And just to highlight one of the points that you made, I think it was Troy Maginnis who also tweeted recently about thinking about larger teams in order to remove dependencies. I think that ties in well with the point you made of the full stack UI API developers in order to be able to do things end to end. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this talk by Tammy Rice on revenue generating UX to the point of building a business. So Tammy worked for JustWorks, which is a company that does, SaaS company that does payroll, benefits, HR, etc. And she was given the objective of increasing their ARR, annual recurring revenues, from $750,000 to $5 million in ARR. Punchline, she did, and we'll talk about some of the things that she did. What I want you to take from this, because we're going to go through this fairly fast, is that self-service is important for B2B companies. B2C, of course, but for B2B, certainly. And the next thing I want you to take away from this is quantify your desired outcomes. The quantification of it makes it real and makes getting the team around a metric, and an outcome metric more, I guess, come together better. So she talked about building data and outcomes, and interestingly, she also started with building trust as she was coming into the organization, and then understanding the problem, and then finding and measuring the data, and moving from goals to outcomes. So I have just one example from one of her slides where she talks about the goals that the team that she came in to work with had when she started out. Things like move from a single long page to multiple steps, smaller pages, move from lots of fields to having less questions, and use data that was brought in, use data from earlier steps, and so on, to something that was outcome driven. And for those of you interested, you can go and look into objectives and key results, OKRs. There's a lot of good material out there on the web. Some of the outcomes that they came out with, or they started using, increased percentage of prospects that request a quote within 1 day of completing registration. Now, to achieve that outcome, you might still do some of those other things that are mentioned in the goals for the project, but having that outcome-based decision-making helps them really track to see if what they did worked. Because sometimes the things that we want to do may be interesting, but they may not have the desired business outcome. Then one of the very basic things that I love that she did was really mapped out the funnel in her case. And you can do it using InVision, PowerPoint, Visio, handwrite, stickies, and then find the leaks, plug the leaks, and then turn on the tap. You don't want to turn on the tap before you really have a process that works well, a funnel that works well. I thought it was a very good talk in terms of just minding the fundamentals. A lot of what needs to be done for a product or a business is common sense, and it's things that people have solved before. Let's use all of that. Things like above the fold, using the same words, pretty pictures. These are all things that we know to do that sometimes we get too busy to incorporate into our product or our business. Just a quick note on above the fold. You'll see there is a growing thought that it does not matter that much anymore. But there is a study by the NN Group as early as 2018 that shows that 57% of viewing time is still spent above the fold, which is lower than the 80% from their 2010 study. But at 57%, this is still significant that it's important enough that you should do. Another one that I want to highlight real quick is minding the copy and minding the flow. Use easy words. Keep it at a 6th to 9th grade level. I got this from one of our client CTOs. Use the same copy and words across the page. Don't make them think. Eliminate fields that you can group. Provide social proof such as In their case, they have clients such as Aetna, or they have service providers such as Aetna, MetLife, which are large name companies that everyone knows. So if someone is not familiar with JustWorks, it provides some proof of their worthiness. Use testimonials. This is from our website. Use pretty pictures, and pretty means something that makes sense to your users, and give them an easy way to interact with your system. Another thing that I just want to highlight, this is a client of ours, Telecom, wonderful startup that's working on protecting seniors through a system. But their CTO, Carl, shared with me some of the work that they did on improving their conversion funnel. And they went from this on the left to this on the right, which I'll show you the metrics, really improved their average time on page and reduced their bounce rate, and had a direct impact on their top line. So the main takeaways here are: start with measuring what is important, and then fundamental UX rules matter. Simple, obvious, beautiful, easy. It's hard to do, but it's important enough to do and get it right. What does this have to do with Agile? Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of value. With this, I'm going to pass it to Mike.
Thanks again, Florence. The next topic, my next takeaway topic, was related to diversity, and particularly diversity without disclosure. So let's talk about disclosure real quick. Next slide, please. So Cheryl told a story about, and by the way, Cheryl was a great speaker, very engaging. She told the story about how she has very bad knees, which is not obvious by looking at someone that their knees are bad. And she always had this horror that if there's only a staircase, she'd have to talk to the person that she's walking with to say, hey, we need to find an alternate route other than the stairs because I can't take the stairs. And it was a really awkward conversation for her. And so in Agile 2018, this was the look of the area coming out of the conference sessions. And she was very happy to see that there was an option on the right where she could just walk up that way naturally and steer the person she's with up this walkway, and essentially not have to disclose this detail about herself to some person that she just randomly met. So that's where we're going here with disclosure. Next slide, please. So everyone has their own set of diversities. Many of them are well known and obvious, but there's also things that are hidden behind the curtain, like anxiety and depression, or in her example, her knees not being good. And in my example, I have a problem with my hearing as I get older. So we all have these things, and it's awkward to have to talk about them. Next slide, please. So since we were in an Agile conference, she was trying to tie this all to Agile-related topics. And so she's like, what if inclusion is like DevOps? And what I think she meant by that is it's kind of all around us, right? So we have to think about inclusion in all aspects of what we do. And it's not just, let's be diverse now and not later. So she has some really good advice here. The one key point I want to point out on here is if you've met one person with some kind of disability, like in this case, deaf people, you've only met one. You don't know every person's experience that has that same disability or condition. And so keep that in mind. Like, just because you worked well with someone who was deaf in the past, that may not translate well to the next deaf person that you end up working with. Next slide, please. So some proactive techniques to add to your team. This concept of yes and is very popular in improv art, and it's the idea of acknowledging someone and moving the conversation forward versus finding reasons why there's something wrong with what they said. But the most powerful thing that I've taken away from this, and it's resonated with everyone I've talked to since, is this concept of user manuals, which is really, as it says here, the guide to me, or a user manual for humans. And the idea behind this is for you to pick a common set of questions that everyone answers online, and then put it in a shared space where everyone can see it. And this way, everyone can learn about everyone's nuances. That maybe someone's grumpy in the morning before they have coffee, or they don't like taking meetings right after lunch because they're sleepy, or whatever it might be. You can start disclosing these things in a team setting where it's more comfortable, and you don't have to have that awkward conversation face to face. Next slide. There was a few other ideas here. I'm very much a proponent of this first breaks all the rules book, which was based on the Gallup poll. Marcus Buckingham does a really great job of explaining really good management techniques, so I definitely recommend that as a read. Next slide. And then the final thought is, as a leader, you have to remember that your power dynamics do matter, or any leader in an organization. What you say has more influence than what somebody else says. And so you have to keep that in mind whenever you're dealing with other people, is that you have to really try to be empathetic and not use that power, or be cognizant that that power exists at least. And with that, I'll pass to Vinayak.
Thanks, Mike, again. And I talked about microservices, but splitting requirements into smaller microservices that do one thing very well is challenging. So event storming is a way to evolve what. So Eric Evans has written a book a few years back about domain-driven design, and the main concept there is that of a bounded context. So how do you separate out bounded contexts having their own vocabulary? So that we learned in this session by Alberto Brandolini, who has written this book on event storming. So it was a very interesting session. And the second session was visually representing our architecture as hexagons instead of the traditional layered architecture that we are all very used to. So these two sessions were, for the architect in my, in me, kind of like these two sessions. So I'm going to cover them real quick. So the next slide. So event storming is nothing you get, nothing but you have a series of events on a timeline in orange stickies. So you get everyone in the room, everyone who's concerned with business, and then you start asking them to stick events on the timeline from left to right. And when they start having conversations around these events, you realize that not all of them agree even on the sequence in which these events happen. So these conversations and these disagreements have to be put on scarlet stickies. So when you have a disagreement, that is the real conversation. So why someone is saying A and not B, instead of event A following B, it is the other way around. So why is that? So when they have these kind of conversations, that's when things start becoming clear, and then finally you have some kind of voting to identify where bottlenecks are, where where you need to focus on getting overcoming bottlenecks. So having identified these events, next slide please, you use these events to tease out bounded contexts. So the relationship between bounded contexts and events is that, a event is the communication between two bounded contexts happens through events. So each bounded context has its own language, the conversation that I referred to. So you evolve the vocabulary for each bounded context, and each bounded context will have its own unit of responsibility, right? So this way you are able to tease out these bounded contexts and then eventually address each one of them using microservices. So that is the idea behind doing this exercise of event storming. Next slide, please. So once you have clarity, we always talk about business logic getting mixed into front end or back end. There's always this problem that I have talked about and seen this happening. Honestly, if you look at our traditional architectural diagram, which is like layered architecture, there's no one place for business logic. Where, we always say that your business logic is flowing into front end or back end, or it's too much in the database or where, but then, there is no explicit agreement where it will be. So here, the core domain of the business logic stays in the center of the hexagon, and everything else is externalized, everything else is abstracted, whether it is the user interface, web, or whether it is the SMS, email, or the text message that is going on, or whether it's a database, that is the persistence layer, or it is testing, where you are testing using some kind of test automation. So everything else are plugins which are externalized. So that I thought was a very good way of having clarity and not letting your business logic get mixed with any of these external things. So this session was really eye-opening for me. Next slide, please. So here's again, the way you segregate dependencies. So you have incoming requests and the application core and external systems. So both sides, you have the dependencies going inward, so that you separate out the infrastructure and outside world from business logic. Unit tests don't talk to the database or the file system. So these are all like plugins which are separate from each other, and it's the business logic in the center. So, and then there are traditional things that we always learned, like, adapter validates input, converts to domain object, and it sends it to the service and then returns a DTO. So that is how the central core communicates with the external world. Next slide, please. I think it's the next slide, Florence, you, so please.
Yes, Vinayak, it's me, but I'm going to pass it back to Jill, because we're almost at the end of our time. And thank you everyone for listening, and we'll send out a recording of this. Jill, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I do. I just remind you, I will send out the recording and the presentation tomorrow. We still have 3 more topics to do, but we will record that offline, and I'll make sure you get a copy of that recording as well. And I also just want to remind you that our next webinar is on September 24th, and it's top grading with microservices and DevOps, and that's going to be presented by Vinayak, who's on this presentation right here. So he'll be on 2 months in a row. So thank you everyone so much for attending, and please keep in touch. Reach out to us on Twitter or LinkedIn, and we're happy to continue the conversation. Thanks to our presenters also, Mike, Vinayak, and Florence. You did great. Thank you so much for all the hard work.